Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, November 30th, 2023. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Israel advocating for further extensions in the pause in the war between Israel and Hamas so that more hostages held in Gaza can be released and more humanitarian aid can get into Gaza. And it looks like the truce is going to an eighth day. Secretary Blinken also says he spoke to Israeli officials about the importance of protecting Palestinian civilians when the fighting does resume. In Washington, the House of Representatives passing a bill to block Iran from getting access to $6 billion in oil revenue that had been frozen due to sanctions but was expected to be available as part of a prisoner exchange earlier this year between the U.S. and Iran. United Nations Climate Summit begins in Dubai. We'll hear from the UN Climate Executive Secretary and talk with Rachel Frazin, energy and environment reporter with The Hill, about the goals and expectations of this conference. The new Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director, Dr. Mandy Cohen, is asked today at a House hearing about a surge in respiratory illnesses in China. A resolution to expel Republican Congressman George Santos is debated in the House. A vote will be happening on Friday. Congressman Santos faces accusations of violating both House ethics and rules and criminal laws for allegedly spending campaign donations on himself. The Senate Judiciary Committee Democrats subpoena two conservative activists, part of an ethics investigation involving Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, over Republican objections. And we remember former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who has died at the age of 100. Wall Street Journal reports from Tel Aviv that Israel and Hamas agreed to extend a temporary truce in Gaza for an eighth day, Egyptian officials said Thursday, in a deal that is expected to involve the release of another 10 hostages, mostly women and children. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is visiting the region, where he urged Israelis to extend the pause and reduce civilian casualties if the fighting resumes. That from the Wall Street Journal. The Israeli military said earlier that Hamas had freed 2 Israeli women. At least 10 Israelis per day, along with other nationals, have been released during the truce in return for Israel's release of at least 30 Palestinian prisoners. Secretary of State Antony Blinken held a news conference in Tel Aviv.
Today marks the 7th day of the humanitarian pause in Gaza that the United States worked closely with Israel, Qatar, and Egypt to put in place. The 7th day that hostages have been freed and are returning home to their families. The 7th day that significantly more humanitarian assistance is getting into the people of Gaza who need it. And the 7th day that civilians in Gaza have been able to move to safer areas. I've come again here today to advance a number of goals. Our immediate focus is working with our partners to extend the pause so that we can continue to get more hostages out of Gaza and more assistance in. We share the elation, the relief of the families from more than a dozen countries, including the United States, who've been reunited with their loved ones. And yet, there are scores of family here in Israel, the United States, and around the world whose loved ones continue to be held captive and who are desperate to get them home safely. We will not stop working until we get every hostage back home with their families and loved ones. At the same time, we continue to surge humanitarian assistance to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Together with the UN, our partners in the region, we have significantly increased the flow of food, water, medicine, fuel to power desalination plants, hospitals, and other critical infrastructure.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken, news conference in Tel Aviv. He also said that Israel has a right to defend itself and wage war against Hamas after Hamas's attack on October 7th. It has an obligation at the same time to account for the safety of Palestinian civilians.
The way Israel defends itself matters. It's imperative that Israel act in accordance with international humanitarian law and the laws of war, even when confronting a terrorist group that respects neither. In my meetings today with the Prime Minister and senior Israeli officials, I made clear that before Israel resumes major military operations, it must put in place humanitarian civilian protection plans that minimize further casualties of innocent Palestinians. That means taking more effective steps to protect the lives of civilians, including by clearly and precisely designating areas and places in southern and central Gaza where they can be safe and out of the line of fire. It means avoiding further significant displacement of civilians inside of Gaza. It means avoiding damage to life-critical infrastructure, like hospitals, like power stations, like water facilities. And it means giving civilians who've been displaced to southern Gaza the choice to return to the north as soon as conditions permit. There must be no enduring internal displacement. All of this can be done in a manner that still enables Israel to achieve its objectives. Of course, we know that every one of these elements is made more complicated by the fact that Hamas intentionally embeds itself with civilians, within and below hospitals, schools, apartment buildings, refugee camps. But Israel has one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world. It is capable of neutralizing the threat posed by Hamas while minimizing harm to innocent men, women, and children. And it has an obligation to do so. Ultimately, that's not just the right thing to do, it's also in Israel's security interest. The Prime Minister and members of the War Cabinet agreed with the need for this approach. We discussed the details of Israel's ongoing planning, and I underscored the imperative to the United States that the massive loss of civilian life and displacement of the scale that we saw in northern Gaza not be repeated in the south. As I told the Prime Minister, intent matters, but so does the result. At the same time, Hamas has choices too. Hamas could immediately release all of the hostages it holds. It could stop using civilians as human shields and stop using civilian infrastructure to stage and launch terrorist attacks. Hamas could lay down its arms, surrender the leaders who were responsible for the slaughter, the torture, the rapes of October 7th.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken at a news conference in Tel Aviv. The White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby telling reporters today at the White House in Washington, "We do not support a permanent ceasefire at this time. We do support the idea of humanitarian pauses. We want to see this 7-day pause turn into 8, 9, 10, and beyond, but ultimately that's going to take Israel and Hamas to agree to the parameters of extending that deal. But in the United States, they'll continue to find an advocate for extension." And we are hearing that there is a 24-hour extension into an 8th day, and additional hostages are being released, and also Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. This is Washington Today. When the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution on Tuesday reaffirming Israel's right to exist, only 2 members voted no. Republican Thomas Massie of Kentucky, who opposed the resolution saying denying Israel's right to exist is a form of anti-Semitism. The congressman wrote on X, formerly Twitter, that anti-Semitism is deplorable, but expanding it to include criticism of Israel is not helpful. And the other no vote, Democrat Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, the only Palestinian American in Congress. She said it was because the resolution makes no mention of the Palestinians. She said the resolution ignores the existence of the Palestinian people and brings us no closer to peaceful coexistence. Congresswoman Tlaib spoke on the House floor today about the war between Israel and Hamas and the reaction in the United States.
Hisham, Kinan, Tahsin are all Palestinian college students who were shot while wearing a keffiyeh and speaking Arabic on their way back to a family dinner in Vermont. Just weeks ago, a 6-year-old Palestinian American child, Wadia, was stabbed 26 times in a hate crime in Illinois. They had to take the knife out of his body. The constant dehumanization of Palestinians have real consequences, Mr. Chair, and it's fueling anti-Palestinian racism and violence. The dehumanization and the rhetoric repeated by many elected officials, many in this chamber, is inciting violence against Palestinians. My heart goes out to every family affected by violence, Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, and any form of hate. One of the Palestinian victims who was shot in Burlington, Hisham, he wrote that this hideous crime did not happen in a vacuum. As much as I appreciate and love every single one of you, I am but one casualty in this much wider conflict. Had I been shot in the West Bank where I grew up, the medical services that saved my life here would likely have been withheld by the Israeli army. The soldier who shot me would go home and never be convicted. Any attack like this is horrific, be it here or in Palestine. That's why when you say your wishes and light your candles today, your mind should not just be focused on me as an individual, but rather as a proud member of a people being oppressed. When I talk about Hisham, Kinan, and Tahsin, Mr. Chair, I think of my 2 Palestinian boys living right here in the United States.
Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, Democrat from Michigan, today on the House floor. The House today voted on a bill that would block Iran from accessing $6 billion in oil revenue that had been frozen in South Korea due to sanctions on Iran and transferred to Qatar. $6 billion was part of a prisoner exchange with Iran brokered by the Biden administration a couple of months ago. Here's some of the debate on the House floor before the vote. You'll hear from Republican Keith Self of Texas and then Democrat Gregory Meeks of New York.
In August, President Biden surrendered access to $6 billion to Iran. Make no mistake about it, for 5 hostages. Once again, he demonstrated weakness to our adversaries. Once again. In doing so, he signaled to Hamas that his administration is willing to reward hostage-taking. The policy of the United States for years was no negotiations with terrorists or with hostage-takers. We knew at that time that precedent was powerful. Now, weak precedent is dangerous. In October, Hamas official Ali Baraka said of the $6 billion deal, quote, "The U.S. conducts prisoner swaps. Only recently it did one with Iran. Why wouldn't it conduct a prisoner swap with us?" End quote. Now Hamas is holding the West hostage, the entire West hostage, as they fortify their defenses while Israeli hostages are traded for Palestinian prisoners, including terrorists. There is only one language that is understood by our adversaries. That is strength. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and send a message that we will not fund the radical jihadist agenda. I yield back.
Does the gentleman reserve? Yes. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Let me just say, I keep hearing this demonstrates weakness. The Biden administration demonstrated strength. Strength. They're willing to stand with your enemies and negotiate. You know, I can recall for me, even in our own country, what I learned to live by. Many folks was thinking that when Dr. King was moving forward with nonviolence, that he was demonstrating weakness, that we should go back and fight. He demonstrated strength. And sometimes in dealing and negotiating, that is where the strength comes from. And if you just go out swinging, you demonstrate weakness. So I say that what Joe Biden has done was kept his word, number one. He said that he would bring, wherever he could, American hostages home. This body has said to American families, we would do everything and anything to bring their families home. We should keep our word. And President Biden kept his word to those 5 American hostages. And the United States House of Representatives should keep its word and not challenge the agreement that the president made to return those 5 American hostages.
Congressman Gregory Meeks, Democrat from New York, ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Committee on the House floor, debating this bill that would block the $6 billion to Iran. You also heard from Republican Congressman Keith Self of Texas. The House passed this bill by a vote of 307 to 119, with 1 voting present. There was 1 Republican voting no, Thomas Massie of Kentucky, and on the Democratic side, 90 Democrats voting yes, 118 voted no. The bill now heads to the Senate. After Hamas's deadly attack on Israel October 7th, there were a number of news reports that the U.S. and Qatar have quietly agreed not to let Iran have access to the $6 billion, given the questions about Iran's possible involvement in the Hamas attack. Most of the news reports, though, quoting anonymous sources. U.S. relations with China came up today during a House subcommittee hearing with the new director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Dr. Mandy Cohen. The subcommittee chair, Morgan Griffith, Republican from Virginia, asking her about a spike in respiratory illnesses in China. He also asked about the case of a secret biolab in California that had a Chinese owner, and it led to speculation about biowarfare research.
With the current surge in respiratory disease in China, this subcommittee sent a letter to you just yesterday, so we don't expect an answer yet, but just yesterday regarding this mysterious uptick in cases. Our hope is that, and if you need us to help, we will, but we are hoping that you can put some pressure in an attempt to try to get China to not mislead the world as they did with COVID-19. What steps is your agency taking, is CDC taking, to ensure that you can gather all the complete and accurate data regarding this mysterious uptick in respiratory illnesses in China?
Well, thank you, Chairman. On that, obviously, it is really important that CDC continues to do our global work and do this scientific diplomacy. What we know as of right now, today, of what's happening in China, they are having an increase in some of their respiratory illness. They're seeing it in the northern part of their country. They're seeing an uptick in their pediatric population. What we do know as of today is we do not believe this is a new or novel pathogen. We believe this is all existing, meaning COVID, flu, RSV, mycoplasma, but they are seeing an upsurgence. We do have an office, CDC does, in China, and our officials have been in touch with our counterparts to make sure that we're understanding the situation there. They were sharing back with us, again, not a novel pathogen.
And you'll keep us informed.
We will.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
According to conversations the Select Committee on China had with local officials of Reedley, California, the CDC refused to take phone calls from city and county officials about that biolab. Why wouldn't the CDC prioritize a call on a serious and potentially deadly issue?
Chairman, we take very seriously working with our state and local partners. We work very closely and collaboratively. And I know in this case, when we were, again, we did not lead the investigation, but when we were invited to join and investigate related to select agents at that lab, we did so. We went on site for 2.5 days and completed that investigation.
Well, what can you tell me about this Ebola refrigerator?
So we did a 2.5-day investigation. We took 300 photos, looked at everything. Our team did not see anything that said Ebola anywhere. Okay. When we heard after the fact that someone said it was labeled Ebola, we immediately followed up and said, do you have a picture? Is there any evidence? Could not produce that. So I think that was an erroneous inclusion in that report. We do not believe that there was any select agents on premises at that level.
Well, it's a dangerous world. Be careful out there. I yield back.
Congressman Morgan Griffith, Republican from Virginia, questioning the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director, Dr. Mandy Cohen, at today's Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations hearing. You can find the full hearing at our video library at cspan.org. Story from Reuters. The United Nations Climate Summit clinched an early victory Thursday, with delegates adopting a new fund to help poor nations cope with costly climate disasters. COP28 President Sultan Al-Jaber said the decision sent a positive signal of momentum to the world and to our work here in Dubai. In establishing the fund on the first day of the 2-week COP28 conference, delegates opened the door for governments to announce contributions, and several did, kicking off a series of small pledges that countries hope would build to a substantial sum. That was from Reuters. The U.S. delegation to the climate summit is being led by Vice President Kamala Harris, and also in attendance, John Kerry, President Biden's special envoy for climate. Simon Steele, United Nations Climate Change Executive Secretary, spoke at the opening ceremony.
This has been the hottest year ever in humanity. So many terrible records were broken, and we are paying the price with people's lives and livelihoods. We're standing at a precipice, facing the global stocktake. And we've got two options. Either we can note the lack of progress, tweaking our current best practices, and encourage ourselves to do more at some other point in time. Or we decide at what point we'll have made everyone on the planet safe and resilient. We decide to fund this transition properly, including the response to loss and damage. And we decide to commit to a new energy system. If we do not signal the terminal decline of the fossil fuel era as we know it, we welcome our own terminal decline. And we choose to pay with people's lives.
Simon Steele is United Nations Climate Change Executive Secretary at the Climate Summit in Dubai. C-SPAN spoke about this summit this morning with Rachel Frazin, energy and environment reporter with The Hill.
Every year, leaders and negotiators gather to try to talk about how we as the world can collectively work on this climate challenge and to try to come to some sort of agreement or to advance progress. This year in particular is being called the Global Stocktake because they are trying to assess how far we've come since the Paris Agreement and what more there is to do.
There's one divisive issue facing the nations at this summit. It's the Loss and Damages Fund. Explain.
Sure. So at last year's COP, nations agreed to set up what's called a Loss and Damage Fund, which is basically a fund to compensate countries that have faced the worst impacts of climate change, especially those who are lower income and can't necessarily afford to rebuild a lot of their infrastructure. Actually, this morning, they agreed to adopt, a framework for setting up the fund. So that includes things like it's going to be hosted temporarily by the World Bank and governed by a board of developed and developing nations.
You mentioned the Paris Agreement, the 2015 Paris Agreement. The goal was to limit the rise in average global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Where are we in reaching that goal?
So there's good news and bad news. The good news is we've made progress. A recent UN report said that, emissions were projected to increase, I think, by 2030 by about 16% prior to the Paris Agreement. Now they're only projected to increase 3%, but that is still an increase, and we are still not on track to hit that 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Why not?
There's still progress to be made in terms of, limiting emissions. Fossil fuels are the main driver of emissions, and countries, I guess, haven't put forward plans that are ambitious enough to really drive those down enough to mitigate global warming, as well as, emissions from other sectors too, like agriculture or landfills.
What did the United States agree to in that agreement, and how close are we to reaching our goals?
The U.S. agreed to the same thing that all the nations agreed to work together to try to keep the world under 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. Since then, the U.S. has said that it hopes to reduce its emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030.
And what is the administration, the Biden administration, doing to reach that goal?
Yeah, several things. First of all, they passed really ambitious climate legislation last year, the Inflation Reduction Act. There are major subsidies in that legislation for clean energy and renewables that are carbon-free and expected to bring down our emissions as they displace fossil fuels from the grid. They've also put forward rules, some of which are finalized, some of which are not yet finalized, like a rule that would bring up the share of electric vehicles in U.S. car sales.
Remind our viewers what happens if this goal is not achieved, because they've seen the headlines recently, the National Climate Assessment reported by the New York Times with dire warnings about the climate conditions. We've seen lots of headlines about the warmest year on record. So what's at stake if the goal is not reached?
Sure, so climate change really is already exacerbating extreme weather, and every little bit of warming is going to make it just that much worse. That's more intense hurricanes, more intense heat waves, droughts, floods, and then there are also what are known as tipping points where, once these things happen, you kind of can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Things like when the Greenland ice sheet melts, that's going to cause sea levels to rise, and it's hard to get that ice back.
A lot have been reported about the host country for COP28, Dubai. Why are they hosting it, and what is the criticism?
So there's a bit of a complicated process, in terms of moving around the world to decide the host country. But the UAE is facing scrutiny on a few fronts. One is fossil fuels. It's a major producer of oil, and they've put the CEO of their national oil company in charge of the conference. There are also concerns about human rights.
And who is this? The UAE appointed the head of the state-owned oil company to lead these negotiations. Who is he?
Sultan Al-Jaber. I'm not sure if I said that right,
Yeah.
but he is the head of the National Oil Company. He's also chair of the National Renewables Company. So he is very much in those worlds, and there have been some accusations that he is going to use his position to try to broker deals to bolster both of those companies.
At this summit.
Yes, that is the accusation. He has denied that.
So what do you expect today and in the following days? How long will the summit last?
It's going to go for another week or two through mid-December. And in the weeks ahead, I think that at the beginning, we're going to see a lot of speeches and commitments and pledges for things that nations or businesses or other stakeholders are doing to combat climate change. And sort of in the second half, the focus is going to shift more towards negotiations to what the kind of things we can agree to. Some things that we might look for are whether the world is going to agree to ramp up renewable capacity, or whether they're going to agree to some sort of phase down or phase out of fossil fuels.
Rachel Frazin is with The Hill, energy and environment reporter on C-SPAN's Washington Journal morning program. Story from the Washington Post. Amid two wars and rivalries cutting across some of the world's biggest economies and biggest polluters, this isn't an easy time for climate geopolitics. COP28 attendees got an early reminder of the fraught dynamics during a seemingly mundane opening session devoted to bureaucratic matters. That's when a Russian delegate requested the floor to object to two of the groups accredited to the climate conference, the Open Society Foundations, founded by George Soros, and the National Democratic Institute. The Russian delegate said these organizations are in fact governed and funded by the government of the United States. It is well known that their record includes interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states. Then John F. Kennedy, the U.S. Special Climate Envoy, asked to respond. He said the United States would like to underscore the importance of ensuring the access of civil society to COP28. He said he was concerned about the unfounded accusations against these NGOs. That from the Washington Post. The story from Yahoo News, inflation continued to cool in October, according to the Federal Reserve's favorite price index. The Personal Consumption Expenditures, or PCE index, grew 3% year over year for the month, down from 3.4% in September, and in line with expectations. Core PCE, which excludes the volatile food and energy categories, grew 3.5%, down from 3.7% from the month prior, and also in line with what economists surveyed by Bloomberg had expected. Month over month, core PCE rose 0.2% in October. President Biden spoke about this today.
Before I begin, I want to say a few words about the recent inflation report we got yesterday. We learned that inflation last month was a big round number, 0. We still have more work to do. Prices are still too high. Corporations are taking advantage. Too many families are still struggling a little bit. But with the record GDP and job growth, this flat inflation number is helping deliver a little bit of breathing room for folks in this right now, especially around the holidays.
President Biden in the White House Oval Office at the start of a meeting with the visiting president of Angola. Wall Street today, the Dow up 520, NASDAQ down 32, and S&P up 17. Reuters reporting from Tokyo that Japan said it has asked the U.S. to suspend all non-emergency V-22 Osprey flights over its territory after one fell into the sea on Wednesday in western Japan, marking the country's first fatal U.S. military plane crash in 5 years. More from today's Defense Department briefing with Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh.
Japan has suspended its Osprey flights and has asked that the U.S. also suspend some Osprey flights. Is there any move or any decision yet by the department to suspend, pause, or otherwise even slow down in that area flights of the Osprey until after recovery operations are finished? And has the department received an official request from Japan to do some sort of stand down?
So I'm not tracking an official request received here at the department. I've seen some of the comments that you just referenced. Right now, the Ospreys are still operating in Japan, but at the time, right now, our focus in terms of what just happened earlier this week remains on search and rescue efforts. So that's the priority, of course, and we're of course eternally grateful for the government of Japan and their Coast Guard for helping in our search and recovery efforts.
So is there no concern within the department that there are possibly problems within the Osprey that should be looked at before others continue to fly?
Well, I would say as a department, and of course the Secretary values, there's a true commitment to safety when it comes to any of our airmen operating any aircraft. Again, I'm not going to get ahead of the investigation. It's currently under investigation to see exactly what happened. And so until that concludes, if there are any, if the investigation concludes that there need to be additional steps taken, we'll certainly do that. But at this time, the investigation is underway on what happened. Idris.
There were 8 personnel on board. Do you know how many have been recovered versus how many are believed to have died?
I don't have an update for you on recovery efforts just yet. Again, we know that there are 8 missing. The search and recovery efforts are ongoing. I hope that we will have more to share soon, but at this moment, I just don't.
The Deputy Defense Secretary Sabrina Singh at the Pentagon briefing today. There was 1 body recovered so far. Washington Today continues in a moment.
People often think C-SPAN is funded by the federal government. In fact, we're a nonprofit organization that receives no government funding. As news consumption changes, you can help ensure the future of C-SPAN's unfiltered coverage of national government and politics. We hope you will consider making a tax-deductible contribution that will support our daily editorial operations. To learn more, visit cspan.org/donate.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app, which is free. From the Washington Post, a defiant Congressman George Santos, Republican from New York, said Thursday that House members were bullying him as a vote on his expulsion from Congress loomed, and warned that if a third effort to remove him were successful, it would lead to the downfall of several other lawmakers down the line. At a news conference, Congressman Santos continued to insist he would never resign and railed against a House Ethics Committee report which detailed a litany of fraud and ethics violations allegations against him as incomplete and littered with hyperbole. The New York Republican also faces 23 federal charges, including fraud, money laundering, falsifying records, and aggravated identity theft. That was from the Washington Post. The congressman held an early morning news conference on the steps of the Capitol, and then there was debate on a resolution to oust him on the House floor. And a vote expected on Friday. Congressman Michael Guest, Republican from Mississippi, chairs the Ethics Committee.
Mr. Speaker, through records that were subpoenaed by the Ethics Committee, we learned that Mr. Santos spent campaign-related funds on personal rent, on personal credit card payments, on ATM withdrawals. We know that he purchased luxury designer purchases at least 2 high-end stores. Then he spent money on payments made at OnlyFans. And that Mr. Santos spent almost $3,000 on Botox treatments. In addition to these questionable expenses, there were travel expenses, questionable expenses, involving trips to Atlantic City, Las Vegas, Nevada, and the Hamptons. Mr. Speaker, in addition to this, there was additional fraud that was uncovered and contained in this report issued by the Ethics Committee. The Ethics Committee found that in 2020, that bank records indicate that Mr. Santos was repaid over $29,000 for fictitious loans that he never made his campaign. The report goes on to say that in 2021, that he falsely reported loaning his campaign $580,000, and he falsely reported loaning an additional $25,000 to his leadership PAC. The report goes on to document that the committee found, according to bank records, that Mr. Santos transferred $200,000 from Redstone Strategies, an entity found to be an unregistered super PAC controlled by Mr. Santos, that he transferred in 2022 alone over $200,000 into his personal account.
Congressman Michael Guest chairs the Ethics Committee on the House floor today during debate on a resolution to expel Congressman George Santos. Congressman Guest also defending the process and the investigation itself in his committee. Congressman Santos spoke against the resolution.
Every member expelled in history of this institution has been convicted of crimes or Confederate turncoats guilty of treason. Neither of those applied to me, but here we are. On what basis does this body feel that precedent must be changed for me? An American citizen, duly elected to represent the 3rd District of New York. I have been convicted of no crimes, Mr. Speaker. My loyalty to this country that gave me life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is true and unquestionable. I stand here today debating for the 2nd time in less than a month for the same exact reasons that were brought up last time. The difference is that one can say I've been indicted once more by the findings of the Ethics Committee, a process that by the admission of the chair himself was not complete and conclusive because they didn't want to put more time into it. As if this committee runs on a schedule that, quite frankly, is in a rush. When some members have been under investigation for over 5 years, some leave while still under investigation, Mr. Chair. So I'm not trying to be arrogant or spiteful or disrespectful of the committee. But I'm curious to know, what is the schedule of the Ethics Committee? Why rush this? To deliver a predetermined outcome sought out by some members of our conference or some members of this body? This is what it looks like to me. It is a predetermined necessity for some members in this body to engage in this smear campaign to destroy me. I will not stand by quietly. They want me out of this body. The people of the 3rd District of New York sent me here. If they want me out, they're going to have to go silence those people and take the hard vote.
Congressman George Santos on the House floor debating a resolution to expel him as a member of Congress. A vote is scheduled for Friday. A 2/3 vote is needed under the Constitution for expulsion of a member of Congress. Some fellow Republicans spoke against this resolution to expel, citing the fact that Congressman Santos has not been convicted of a crime. They included Troy Nehls of Texas, Clay Higgins of Louisiana, Matt Gaetz of Florida. But Jake Sherman of Punchbowl News reports that Congressman Steve Scalise, the majority leader, Republican from Louisiana, plans to vote yes to expel Congressman Santos, telling Jake Sherman he's going to have his day in court, which he deserves. Congressman Santos also today introduced a resolution to expel Congressman Jamal Bowman, Democrat from New York, for pulling a fire alarm in a House office building in September when there was no emergency. Congressman Bowman in a statement saying no one in Congress or anywhere in America takes soon-to-be former Congressman George Santos seriously. Senate Judiciary Committee Republicans, writes Politico, walked out of the committee to boycott a vote authorizing subpoenas for information from conservative activists and donors about their ties to conservative Supreme Court justices. The panel voted 11-0 to authorize subpoenas for conservative judicial activist Leonard Leo and Texas billionaire Harlan Crow on their close personal and financial relationships with some justices, with no Republicans left in the room besides the ranking member Lindsey Graham. Graham exited once the vote was underway and did not vote. The subpoenas are part of an ongoing investigation into ethics at the Supreme Court and how undisclosed gifts and personal ties between major activists, donors, and justices may have granted access to individuals and groups with business before the court. That was from Politico. Here is some of what happened today. Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, committee chair, said he did not think that the court's recent issuance of ethical guidelines for justice went far enough and that it did not have an enforcement mechanism, and that made the committee's work on this issue still relevant.
The committee's investigation of the court's ethical crisis, and these subpoenas in particular, are key pieces of our legislative effort to establish an effective code of conduct. My Republican colleagues claim our efforts are motivated by my disagreement with the court's recent decisions. But I first asked Chief Justice Roberts in writing to address the court's lack of enforceable code of conduct 11 years ago. And an enforceable code of conduct would apply to all 9 justices appointed by presidents of both parties. One Republican claimed that I am, quote, opening Pandora's box, but I am only seeking subpoenas for 2 people who have refused to comply with this committee's oversight request for months. Contrast this with the Republicans' unprecedented subpoena authorization in 2020 for a crossfire hurricane investigation. They provided the chair with blanket authorization to subpoena more than 50 named persons and an unlimited number of unnamed persons. Unlimited. In that case, committee Democrats circulated 22 amendments, 16 of which we offered for a vote. The vast majority of those amendments related directly to the subject matter of the subpoena authorization. In contrast, today, committee Republicans have circulated 177 amendments, the vast majority of which have nothing to do with the Supreme Court ethics crisis. Both Leonard Leo and Harlan Crow are central players in this crisis. Their attempts to thwart the legitimate oversight efforts of the Congress should concern all of us.
Democratic Senator Dick Durbin, Judiciary Committee Chair. All Republicans on the committee opposed the subpoenas. Here is John Cornyn of Texas asking a question to the ranking member, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina.
These are private citizens that the majority of the committee seeks to subpoena, correct? Senator Graham?
Yes.
Are you familiar with any legitimate legislative purpose for subpoenaing private citizens?
I think this is a charade politically motivated to attack the integrity of the Roberts Court, to act on what they said they wanted to do to destroy Clarence Thomas's reputation. I think if they really cared about the ethics practices of the court, we would be looking into Sotomayor's situation, Justice Sotomayor, where staff members apparently called people, you need to sell some books if she's going to speak. So, yeah, I think this is all politically motivated. I think the 2 private citizens involved, particularly Leonard Leo, is at the top of the guy I hate most list in the conservative world. I think this is despicable, what they're doing to these people. I think it's bad for the country. I think this is a joke simply because the bill to fix the problem they claim it exists, they won't even bring it up to the floor. So this is an investigation of private citizens, Senator Cornyn, that I think is politically motivated, not legislatively motivated, because if you wanted to pass legislation, you've already done it out of committee. All you got to do is bring it to the floor. You're in charge. So no, I think it's patently obvious. There's no legislative purpose. This is designed to get people they don't like and try to destroy Clarence Thomas.
Republican Senators Lindsey Graham and John Cornyn of the Judiciary Committee went on to authorize the subpoenas for Leonard Leo and Harlan Crow on a vote of 11-0. Republicans walked out of the room and did not vote. Both Leonard Leo and a spokesperson for Harlan Crow saying they don't plan to comply with the subpoenas. And one other procedural note, you heard Senator Durbin mention this, Republicans on the committee were prepared to offer nearly 200 amendments calling for subpoenas in various investigations of the Biden administration they'd like to do. But in the end, they were not offered. Instead, Republicans invoked a Senate rule, or tried to, that forced the committee to finish by noon Eastern, and that attempt did not work. Instead, the committee chair called for a vote on the subpoenas. The subpoenas are subject on the Senate floor to a filibuster, so that would need 60 votes to pass. Republicans potentially could block that. NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell posting that a new lectern has been added to the James Brady briefing room. The last change was during the Bush 43 era, that would be President George W. Bush, and completes a refresh of this space, which is part of the public face of the White House. The White House Press Secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, spoke about it at the start of today's briefing.
So today, I am honored to speak to you from our brand new Press Toast lectern. Yay! Yay! And I'm proud to name the lectern in honor of Alice Dunnigan and Ethel Payne, the first 2 Black women in White House Press Corps, in addition to the annual White House Correspondents Association Award in their name. We are excited to help remember their service to the American public in this way. The Dunnigan-Payne lectern and its accompanying seal were designed over the last year, and they replaced the previous lectern, which had been used in our briefing room since 2007. The previous lectern will be preserved. I'm sure many of you were wondering what was going to happen to the previous lectern, so it's going to be preserved. Now, this lectern, a blend of modernity and tradition, is meant to embody the essence of our country's stature, built using a harmonious combination of metal and black walnut, as you can see. The metal speaks to the resilience and strength of our nation, while the black walnut represents the rich history and the deep-rooted foundations upon which this country stands. The blue paint signifies vigilance, perseverance, and justice. Every member of this team, consisting of Army, Navy, and the civilians, brought unique expertise and skills to the project, and we are deeply grateful for their work and this new addition to our shared space. So, welcome to the lectern here.
The White House Press Secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre. Joining her today at the news conference was John Kirby, Strategic Communications Coordinator for the White House National Security Council. And as that part of it was ending, a reporter, Simon Ateba, asked why he was not being called on to ask a question.
Can I ask you a follow-up on Angola? One question. It's so surprising that you don't you are receiving an African leader and you can't take a question from an African journalist.
We can end this.
Sorry,
I have one question.
Basically,
John said Marco Rubio.
It's not about ending the briefing. I want to ask an African question because I am receiving an African
question. All right, thank you so much. Oh my God. All right, we can end this briefing if it's not going to be respectful here. Chris.
That's what I'm saying. You are receiving an African leader and you don't take questions.
Thanks, everybody.
I have a question about gas prices.
Thanks, everybody.
Can we do one about the quality gas prices?
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre leaving without taking any reporters' questions after John Kirby, spokesperson for the White House National Security Council, did take questions. Trying to ask those questions that were not being called on, Simon Ateba, chief White House correspondent at Today News Africa, and he was referring to the president of Angola visiting the White House. News broke Wednesday night that Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, has died at the age of 100. Associated Press describes Henry Kissinger as the diplomat with the thick glasses and gravelly voice who dominated foreign policy as the United States extricated itself from Vietnam and broke down barriers with China. He was on C-SPAN many times. In 1999, at the Nixon Library in California, he spoke about his book Years of Renewal. An audience member asked about what might have happened in Vietnam if the Watergate scandal had not led to Richard Nixon's resignation.
By the time President Ford faced that crisis, the situation had become hopeless. If it had not been for the congressional acts which were made possible by the Watergate crisis, I believe that Vietnam would have taken a different course. We made the Vietnam Agreement on the assumption that we could continue economic and military aid, on the assumption that the Vietnamese would take care of their own security, but that if there were extreme violations of the accords, we would enforce them. Now afterwards, President Nixon's critics kept saying he didn't have a right to make such a promise. It is absurd. We are enforcing the Gulf War Agreement every day. If the United States makes a peace agreement for which thousands of Americans have died and then doesn't enforce it, it is surrendering. So the question of having the right to enforce it never occurred to us. And we said it in the appendixes of all my memoirs. Of all 3 volumes, I have all the public statements we made, which is, of course, constantly ignored by the critics. Then the Congress cut military aid and economic aid to Vietnam by 50% each of the peacetime years. So it had gone from $2.5 billion to 700 million while inflation was raging as a result of the energy crisis. Half of the Vietnamese Air Force was grounded. Ammunition was rationed. And there was absolutely no way. And they passed a law prohibiting military action in, over, or near Vietnam. When they started attacking in 1975 during the Ford administration, in total violation of all agreements, we wanted to bluff a move, and we wanted to send a carrier that was anyway going to the Indian Ocean through the Gulf of Tonkin. It hadn't left Manila before congressional hearings were called. And we had to reaffirm the act of Congress. I do not think Vietnam would have fallen in a second Nixon term. I'm certain he would have responded already in 1973. In fact, he had planned to respond in 1973 when everything blew up. And I believe it is one of the saddest episodes in American history.
Former Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger in 1999 on C-SPAN's Book TV at the Nixon Library in California. Henry Kissinger died Wednesday at the age of 100. Many tributes coming in. Former President George W. Bush in a statement saying America has lost one of the most dependable and distinctive voices on foreign affairs. I have long admired the man who fled the Nazis as a young boy from a Jewish family, then fought them in the United States Army. When he later became Secretary of State, his appointment as a former refugee said as much about his greatness, as it did America's greatness. And President Joe Biden with the statement, I'll never forget the first time I met Dr. Kissinger. I was a young senator, and he was a Secretary of State, giving a briefing on the state of the world. Throughout our careers, we often disagreed, and often strongly. But from that first briefing, his fierce intellect and profound strategic focus was evident. And even Chinese President Xi Jinping, in a statement calling Kissinger a world-renowned strategist and a good old friend of the Chinese people. It goes on, half a century ago, he made historic contributions to the normalization of China-U.S. relations with brilliant strategic vision benefiting both countries as well as changing the world. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's free evening newsletter, Word for Word. You get the stories making news in Washington emailed to you every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.